Hello, and thank you for tuning in to my poster presentation. My name is Patricia Fraino, and I'm a PhD student from the University of Calgary, and today I will be presenting on the complexity of micro to centimeter scale heterogeneities in geological and geomechanical properties in fine-grained deposits and how to quantify it. Geological heterogeneities exist across a gradational continuum of scales in unconventional reservoirs, from meters to kilometer scale heterogeneities, to centimeter scales, which consist of sedimentary beds, and down to the millimeter scale with bounding lamina, and even at the thin section level, where heterogeneities exist in terms of microfabric and even mineralogical differences, which collectively can affect extraction and reservoir productivity. Now, to date, most studies have assessed the vertical and lateral heterogeneity at the meter to kilometer scale. However, the role of centimeter and millimeter scale heterogeneities has not been broadly assessed yet. In order to try to understand this question, we're going to be looking at core samples from the Lower Triassic Montney Formation. The Montney Formation is a westward thickening wedge of siliciclastic carbonate sediment that records the deposition between the offshore and shore face environments. Now, for today's presentations, as highlighted with the blue box, we will be looking at cores that occur in the proximal to distal offshore environments in the northeast British Columbia in the upper and middle Montney. There's a total of 5 facies in the studied cores. However, for this study, we mainly sampled 3 facies, which are massive siltstone, stratified siltstone, and bioturbated siltstone, as they make up a total of 91% of total cumulative facies percentage in both cores. Now, this centimeter scale facies can be further subdivided into simplified microfacies. As you can see, F1 comprises mostly 1 microfacies, whereas stratified siltstone is commonly subdivided into 2 microfacies. These are pinstripe laminated siltstone, shown in the green, and planar to cross-stratified siltstone, shown in the yellow. Lastly, bioturbated siltstone, which is mostly wispy lamination due to bioturbation. However, in some rare occasions, can exhibit undisturbed cross-stratified siltstone. For this project, we studied 10 samples, and 4 steps were taken to characterize the composition, mechanical, and sedimentary fabric properties, which we used a gridding system of 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. Each core sample went through the same workflow. First, each core piece was CT scanned to quantify sedimentary fabric. To sample composition, we obtained using an XRF gun with a spot size of 8 millimeters. Hardness was obtained using a piccolo tool. And lastly, to better understand how the composition relates back to the mineralogy and diagenetic characteristics, thin section analysis was conducted. Lastly, natural calcoid field fractures were characterized along both chord intervals, and a total of 75 fractures were looked at and subdivided into 3 types. These are bed parallel fractures, vertical to subvertical, and brecciated. Now, for this study, I'm only going to focus on bed parallel and vertical, as brecciated fractures occur in all facies. Due to time constraint, I will only be showing an example of the gridding system for the stratified siltstone, facies 2. Key observations for CT scan in HU values show high values for the planar to cross-stratified siltstone, whereas the pinstripe laminas exhibit lower HU values. Compositional properties of F2, on the other hand, show a narrow silica component irrespective of the microfacies. However, calcium and aluminum show key differences between the 2 contrasting microfacies, with the lighter laminas having higher calcium and lower aluminum, and vice versa for the darker lamina. The relationship between calcium and aluminum also show a strong relationship between composition, fabric, and hardness values, in which lighter laminas have the highest hardness values in comparison to the darker pinstripe laminas. And overall, this facies exhibits a high degree of heterogeneity. We ran a discriminant analysis to better understand how all variables related back to our microfacies. The smaller diagram on the right highlights all the key relationship from composition, fabric, and hardness, and so arrows which have the same directions have positive trends, and arrows with larger angles between them have negative trends. For example, the same direction and low angle between hardness, HU, calcium, as well as the silicon-aluminum ratio arrows indicate a positive trend, whereas the larger angle between hardness and aluminum, sulfur, and iron arrows represent a negative correlation. Now, when we look at how our data is plotting on the discriminant analysis, we can see that there's 3 clusters pertaining to the different microfacies. Now, if we look at our first cluster of planar to cross-stratified siltstone, we can see that they commonly have the highest hardness, and this is largely due to the fact that they are heavily cemented by both dolomite, calcite, and quartz and tend to have negligible clay minerals. Cluster number 2 is of bioturbated siltstone that consists of a disorganized fabric in which some areas exhibit interconnected cement, but commonly abruptly transition into more matrix-rich areas with elevated micas and pyrite that locally exhibit less calcite cement. Our last cluster is of massive siltstone and pinstripe laminated siltstone. These microfacies have significantly less calcite cement and exhibit an increase in mica, which can explain why we're getting lower hardness values. When we look at the hardness distribution in terms of the microfacies, we can see that bioturbated siltstone and massive siltstone have narrow hardness distributions and are more or less unimodal. The narrower distribution therefore indicates less dispersion of the hardness data and are therefore more homogeneous. Whereas the microfacies that comprises the stratified siltstone have much broader distribution and consist of a bimodal distribution, suggesting that hardness values are more dispersed and therefore the samples are more heterogeneous. Now, if we relate back this hardness distribution to the fractures, we can see that bioturbated siltstone, being overall brittle, having generally well-connected carbonate cement, tends to have tall vertical fractures which only terminate when there's an abrupt facies change. Now, bed parallel fractures are most commonly found in stratified siltstone and exclusively occur when there's an abrupt transition from pinstripe laminated siltstone to planar or cross-stratified siltstone. And so we can determine that change in fabric is playing a key role on the location of bed parallel fractures in stratified siltstone. Lastly, in massive siltstone, although uncommon to see fractures, they tend to occur along individual lamina with a more or less homogeneous bed. The lack of fracture in this microfacies might be due to the elevated aluminum component and higher presence of micas, making the rock hard to break in comparison to the stratified and bioturbated siltstone facies. To summarize this study, there's a relationship and variability between sedimentary fabric, composition, and mechanical properties. This was clearly illustrated using a linear discriminant analysis, where facies with higher aluminum content, iron, and sulfur tend to have the lowest hardness, and vice versa, facies with higher calcium component tend to have the highest mechanical hardness. Lastly, utilizing key findings from the gridding and statistical analysis, we can see how variation in geomechanical, elemental, and sedimentary fabric might have a direct influence on the characteristics of natural fractures along the study course. I would like to thank the Tide Oiler Consortium and NSERC for supporting this project, and thank you for listening.